I'll often hear guys say, well, I don't want to disclose to my wife because things are going really well right now.
They want to protect themselves from shame or from what other people might think of them.
The vast majority either are discovered or disclosed improperly.
What do I do with this information? How am I going to talk to him? What does this say about me?
How do I know that's everything?
One of the things that ruptures or shatters in betrayal is trust again and again. Till the wife's like, I don't know how I'm going to ever trust you again.
I want to be honest with you, and I think we should have this conversation with our marriage counselor present.
Welcome to UNAshamed, the First Light podcast. UNAshamed invites you into conversations on sexual compulsion, betrayal, and redemption in Christ. This is your host, Reverend Jonathan Shilts. Today, we are talking about what happens for both strugglers and their spouses when secret sexual sin comes to light. Joining us for this conversation is Men's Director David Noble, Spouse Care Director Karen Kallberg, and Clinical Care Director Shari Montague. Everyone, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having
Jonathan.
me.
It's good to be here.
Shari, implied within the idea of secret sin being revealed is behavior being hidden. What factors play into strugglers' decision to hide their compulsive sexual behaviors?
There's a lot of factors when people decide to hide their sexual sins. A lot of our guys will say that they hide it because they don't want other people to know that that's what they're doing. They want to protect themselves from shame or from what other people might think of them. Sometimes they'll say it's because they knew that they would upset their wives by telling them about that or would upset somebody else. So they're trying to protect somebody else in doing that. All of those things can be happening at the same time. Secrets have a massive impact on the relationship itself, even to the point where wives will say, I knew something was wrong. I knew something was off. I just couldn't figure out what it was. Anytime I would ask him, he would lie to me. So I didn't know what was happening, but I just knew something was wrong. And that's a common experience for wives, that they can feel like something is off. Even if the wife doesn't feel it, often we see increases in irritability or anger from our men who are struggling with compulsive sexuality. They might have an intense shame response if somebody catches them, or if somebody says something to them, they're afraid that person knows, so they'll respond in a really shocked way that's bigger than what would be anticipated for just a common response. And you can see that in yourself. Most of us as kids have had the experience of, oh, I broke that vase, but I'm not going to tell mom and dad, and I'm going to put it away. And then if mom and dad ask you a question about it or about something, you're a little sensitive about it.
I was wondering if there's space in this conversation to talk about the difference between secret keeping and just not sharing what isn't someone else's business. Something in between secrecy and confidentiality. I can't think of an example.
You're thinking about, I think you're thinking about something like, we will often tell our men that there are things their wife ought to know and there are things that would be unhelpful for their wife to know. Wives will often struggle with that because they feel like they want to know everything. The truth is they don't want to know everything most of the time. They want to know the big picture of something that happened, but they don't necessarily want to know the details. Or when they find out the details, they'll later say, I wish I didn't know those details. So I think you're kind of getting at it from the like
helpful or unhelpful disclosure.
Unhelpful. The difference between honesty and truthfulness and how you navigate.
I had one thought. I was thinking about factors that play, and like David and Shari, I'd love to hear your thoughts. The immediate answer that came to mind was fear of loss. This is true for spouses. They don't disclose because certainly in the marriage, fear of the wife's reaction or whether or not this marriage will continue. And so I think often what comes up in secrecy and what brings people to First Light is that fear of loss.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'll often hear guys say, well, I don't want to disclose to my wife because things are going really well right now. And if I were to share this, things would not go so well. And depending on the guy and where they are in their journey, I'll say to them, things are only going well because you're keeping secrets. Is that really the basis for a healthy relationship? Obviously, no. So it's setting up this dynamic where the husband is keeping secrets, which is a power play, but he believes he'll make things worse by sharing it. And it's really not fair to her because she's operating with only part of the information. But he doesn't see it that way. He sees it as he's protecting her somehow. But really, it's a coping mechanism just to continue to engage in the behaviors that he's afraid he's not going to be able to survive without.
And is there really an ideal time to tell somebody that you've been engaging in betrayal-like behaviors? Right now might not seem like an ideal time, but 15 years down the road isn't going to be great either.
Right. Yeah. There's always a good reason to put it off, but the good reason really isn't such a good reason. There's better and worse times.
And better and worse ways.
So that actually leads us into our next point. There are many ways secret sin can come to light. Two of the most damaging are discovery, where either the spouse or someone like a coworker or a family member discovers a struggler in a shameful sexual activity. And the other is poor disclosure, where the struggler may confess little bits and pieces or all of their sin without considering the needs for the person they are confessing to. Can you speak to how men can be affected by being discovered or by poorly disclosing their sin?
Yeah, it's important to note the most common way this comes up is a spouse just asking kind of out of the blue, have you been looking at porn, or is that part of your story? Or, so she's not necessarily discovering him in the act, but has asked a question. I would coach a man if I was in that situation to say, I want to be honest with you, and I think we should have this conversation with our marriage counselor present.
But I have all sorts of feelings that go for spouses, and she's like, there's something terrible that's coming.
Something terrible is coming. And the question is, do you want to have something terrible coming while you're driving to the grocery store together or in a therapeutic environment? Either way, it's going to be painful.
Yeah.
But it will be better if they're both prepared, more so than her on a whim, or even just an instinct, or a gut sense of, something's off, like Shari was saying. And I don't know what it is, but I've heard about this thing that men struggle with, and I'm going to ask the question. So that's probably the most common I hear. Then I'll hear examples of she picked up my phone and there was porn that hadn't closed down off of there, or she walked by me as I was, sitting at a table and the computer was in front of me and she looked over my shoulder and saw what I was looking at, or she came in the room, grabbed the computer and looked at it. Those are pretty rare, actually. And maybe in that same level of rareness as a guy hears a talk about pornography or feels a particular sense of a guilty conscience and all of a sudden goes and tells her everything. I've heard plenty of stories of guys who will be at like a men's retreat and will call their wives from the retreat to start disclosing because they feel so bad about it and they've kept the secret for so long. And that is not the spirit at work. I'm sorry if you think it is. That's not how he works. He does not work in that way that intentionally, deliberately harms other people. It is going to hurt, but that's different from harm. And there's a more helpful way to disclose.
Can you also talk to the trickling information of
trickle effect?
Yeah, the trickle effect of just providing little bits of information, thinking, hey, it won't harm her as much if I spread my disclosure across 6 months.
Mm-hmm. I think a guy will either be asked or feel compelled to give some information, and he'll give a little bit of information like, yes, I am still looking at porn, or yes, I have looked at porn in the last week. And then, maybe a few weeks later, we'll realize he isn't feeling the sense of relief that he was hoping to in that disclosure. And we'll say, well, actually, I've also been texting with a woman, and maybe it would be considered an emotional affair or something like that. I don't really know. But I just want you to know I'm not texting that person anymore. Maybe the reality is he's engaged in sexual activity with another person, but he's trying to get a sense of how much rejection is he going to have to experience with each level of disclosure. And that is potentially the most damaging way to do it, because the spouse is going through a crisis of understanding the other person's identity. She sees this man a certain way, and then she has to readjust her expectation to seeing him in a way that she didn't see him before. And then before her nervous system and psyche have really fully been able to metabolize that and accept that, he's now disclosing additional information, which further disrupts her sense of self and her understanding of who he is. And the more often this happens, the more likely she's going to think, I know he's holding something back. So even if he were to disclose everything, she would still be left wondering, well, how do I know that's everything? That's a really unfair place to put somebody else.
Karen, how does that affect a spouse who either has that moment of discovery or a poor disclosure?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to what David said, because one of the things that ruptures or shatters in betrayal is trust. When it's a staggered disclosure where the husband's sharing pieces of information, and sometimes he may not even have remembered that something was part of his behavior when it comes to him later on. So I'm not even saying that this is intentional, but on the wife's experience, she's like grappling with the first piece of information and trying to like absorb it, trying to process it. She's like, I think maybe I can cope. And then there's another piece, and she has to go through that whole process again. And that, for the trust process, is like ripping it apart again and again till the wife's like, I don't know how I'm going to ever trust you again. That's why staggered disclosure is so painful for the wife. On the other hand, if it's discovery, it's an accidental finding out. So whether or not she is looking for a photo of her children on his phone and finds photos of other people, or looking for information in his email for maybe a bill and finds out more information about other financial things that she was not aware of. So usually there's a shock factor that comes with discovery, because not looking for it, feeling completely blindsided. And then she's also tasked with like, now what do I do with this information? How am I going to talk to him? How do I make sense of it myself? What does this say about me? There's a lot of crisis with either form of discovery or staggered disclosure. I think often the piece that's hardest for wives to wrestle with is like, how in the world do I figure out how to trust again? Because you have been dishonest, and now I have to try to figure out what has actually been true, not just of your life, but of our shared memories together. Like what you were doing on our honeymoon, or on this family vacation, or when I was in the hospital with my child. Grappling with all of these things, that trust piece, which is why we recommend, like, please have someone who's trained in a structured full disclosure, who can guide this process carefully to prevent additional harm that's not necessary.
I think there's sometimes a disconnect between when men believe harm should be processed and when that harm is experienced, because men will think, I did something a year ago. I'm feeling guilty about that. So now I'm going to confess that to my wife. But she doesn't experience that as something that happened a year ago. She experiences that as something that happened right then in that moment of discovery.
Yeah, I think that is important, Jonathan, that we acknowledge that time is different for the person who is doing the sexual acting out versus the person who's receiving the information. So it is often hard when husbands disclose, or when a wife discovers what's happening, because there can be a time dissonance between the spouses that creates an experience difference, where often he feels better because he's purged his conscience, or he feels like he's done what he's needed to do in telling her, and then she feels terrible. So often when I'm working with a couple, when they've initially come in and we're talking this through, is I try to name that so that they both can hear, yeah, it makes sense that you, wife, are feeling like this is the end of the world. And why, for him, husband, you're feeling pretty good about yourself right now. There's a real dissonance in what you're experiencing. And part of that is the time lapse. She is experiencing it in the moment. It doesn't matter if it was 20 years ago when she first finds out about it. It happened then.
Shari, I'm sure that there are people listening to the negative impact that discovery or poor disclosure have, and they might think, see, this is why I should never tell anyone. This is why I need to keep this hidden. No good will ever come from this. At the same time, though, First Light strongly believes that disclosure in a process that we've already talked about called structured full disclosure is essential for helping both spouses and strugglers heal. Why is this type of disclosure so important to the healing process?
Disclosure in general. So whether you're doing, it applies to the full disclosure, but it applies to the question, why should I even tell anybody? It is the sense of keeping things hidden. A secret, particularly in a marriage, creates a wedge between you, even if you don't realize that it's there, even if the other person doesn't realize it's there. It creates cracks in the foundation of that relationship. And those often will become bigger and worse. It also, for whatever reason, is reminding me of The Telltale Heart by, I think it's Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, that wrote The Telltale Heart, which is about a man who has murdered somebody and hides him in the floorboards of his house. And people come in to talk to him, and he's constantly hearing the sound of the dead person's beating heart in his head, and he ends up telling them. It's kind of a look at the craziness of hiding a major sin. I think that happens for our men sometimes, where there's this sense of, I have this massive thing I'm hiding. Their conscience is heavy. So those are a couple of the reasons to move forward with disclosing to your wife what's going on. We've said there are better ways of doing that, and there are worse ways of doing that. The advice of a therapist, particularly a certified sex addiction therapist, it would be the best way to go about that. As far as a structured full disclosure, that process is necessary in the sense that it is leveling the playing field. So often I will tell couples that your relationship house is in rubble because of the secrets in your marriage, because of the sexual acting out. And by doing a structured full disclosure, what you're doing is you're clearing the rubble so that you can start rebuilding. If the rubble isn't cleared, obviously you can start trying to build on that, but the structure itself is not going to be sturdy, and it's going to have, lots of problems structurally if you don't clear that. So it is not, this is going to save my marriage, but it is being honest about what's happening in the marriage so that the marriage has the best chance of moving forward as a healthy, strong home rather than built on secrecy and shame.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that disclosing somebody's sexual past or their sexual sin well is not the work of healing. It's laying the groundwork for healing.
Exactly.
In the disclosure process, we help spouses know what they need to know, and that helps them with a sense of understanding who this person is and whether they want to remain committed to them in the relationship. And later on in our program, men explore their sexual fantasy, which is not helpful to share with a spouse. I've heard, especially from my guys, well, I shared all this other stuff with her. I don't mind sharing this work with her, because they feel they need to do that, to be honest. And that's often not really helpful.
There can be confusion about what I need to be honest about and what brings intimacy. When we are talking about radical honesty with self and others, right? We want them to be doing that. We want ourselves to be doing that. But there is also, as you're relearning that, there's ways to do that poorly and ways to do that helpfully. Sharing your sexual fantasy with your spouse may be a really good practice to do, but not based on the work that you did at First Light, the help of a therapist, and caveats about what is good for them to hear and good for you to share. There is a sense of, if my husband heard all the things in my head, or you guys heard all the things in my head all the time, you'd probably be pretty unhappy with me, right? Like, we're not meant to have our thoughts be unfiltered. We purposely work on filtering and guarding our tongue, and we need to filter them.
Yeah, I think that's really gets to the core of what good disclosure is it considers the needs of the person you're confessing to.
Yes.
It's not necessarily about the person who's been struggling with behavior getting everything off their chest. It is about entering into a deeper intimacy with the person you're supposed to be having an honest relationship with.
Right. Well, and that's where I would recommend that if somebody, if we have a man out there who's listening who hasn't told his wife, nobody knows, and he's feeling conviction, that's a perfect opportunity to call and talk to David, the men's director, or Bryce, who's our intake person, or a therapist, because there is a place for that confession. You don't have to necessarily think about the stakes aren't high for them to hear your story. They're a neutral third party. And so if you need to confess it, finding that third person to confess to, and then from there figuring out how to share appropriately with the person that you've hurt. so that then you're able to think about what he or she needs versus what you want to confess. I'd almost always recommend that you talk to somebody first before you disclose to your spouse.
I even go so far as to say that disclosure is not confession. In disclosing, I want to be present to my loved one so that I can empathize with their experience. If I'm looking for catharsis, or if I'm looking for absolution, or if I'm looking for an assurance of forgiveness, I'm not doing it with my spouse for the right reason. So I need to have confessed and received that assurance of pardon from someone else so I can be present for her. Not that she doesn't need to forgive, but that's not the point of the disclosure. The disclosure is to give the information so that a decision can be made by the spouse of how we're going to move forward now that I have all the information.
We're getting into the territory, without naming it, of disclosure could lead to some spouses not forgiving, separating, or even divorcing their husbands.
Yes. I think when I hear spouses talk about their husbands, sometimes spouses come in with the hope that with a disclosure, things can get better. And that may happen, and it also may not. The hope is you have the information to make an informed decision. And what I do advise women is try not to rush ahead. You don't have to figure out the rest of your marriage. Take it one step at a time, what things you can do today.
Can I say something? I would want to say to the men out there that if that's you, I don't want you to lose hope, that the Lord can use even a bad discovery or a bad disclosure, and you can still work through that. So I really want guys to understand that wherever they are in the process, having someone who knows what they're doing, being involved in the process is going to be helpful. And unfortunately, not all counselors and certainly not all pastors know how to be helpful in initiating this process. I had a pastor text me just the other day saying, what resources would be good for me to recommend to a couple that I'm about to do a disclosure with? And I picked up the phone right away and called the man and said, please tell me I misunderstood what your text was saying and that you are not going to try and do a disclosure with a couple. And he said, oh, no, the disclosures happened already. I'm trying to find a way to encourage them now that that's happened.
I will often tell spouses, another analogy I use a lot is surgery. You don't do surgery by yourself. If your doctor says you need surgery, it's not, you don't get your knife and start cutting when you get home. And you need a specialist to do it. Not any doctor can do a surgery. And so being aware of that, looking for people to help you find the right surgeon or the right way to do it, or if you need help figuring out how to do that surgery, it's okay to say, hey, this is a specialized thing that needs a specialized care, just like you would for surgery, which I don't think we do very often when it comes to mental health. We think everything's equal when it comes to that, and it's not true.
I think one of the things that I've been pondering, and perhaps what spouses struggle with in this process, is when there's been a discovery or staggered or like the beginning of a disclosure. Often a wife's urge is to I need to know everything right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very normal response.
So normal, because you're I don't even know how to reconcile what's real. My encouragement for spouses in that situation, and it may be that you've already started getting some information from your husband, is if you can, I recommend you wait and ask a professional to help you. And here's why. The professional will evaluate the information and make sure it's thorough so that you don't have staggered disclosure. I think Michelle Mays often refers it as death by 1,000 paper cuts. Let's do the surgery once and for all and not a little bit at a time. Also, a good therapist will also make sure you have support. It's not just, here's the information, boom, good, go home. But a good therapist should guide you in what things do you need to support yourself in processing this information. How can you advocate for yourself in the days ahead? And how do we want to navigate disclosure in the future? There are many different pieces that can help lay a solid foundation of care for the spouse and for the one who has been acting out. And so for those spouses who feel that urge, I need to know everything as soon as possible, reach out to us. We would love to help and support you in that process. If not, find a CSAT who understands the process and the intricacies and the many layers to look at so that you can get the best care possible.
Lastly, I'm sure there are plenty of listeners who are listening to this and thinking, a healthy disclosure sounds great, but that seems like too big of a challenge, or the shame is too great, or for even spouses, I'm just afraid to know what might be on the other side of that. They think it is better to struggle in silence, in secrecy, in disintegration than to risk it. What encouragement can you share for someone who feels like this is too high of a price to pay for healing?
I think it's a pretty common way of thinking about life, that I would rather continue in the way that I've been going, even though I know it's not optimal. It's good enough, and it's probably as good as it's ever going to get, and I don't want to make it worse. There have been huge chunks of my life where I've approached life that way, and I can say it's just a really sad way to live. That is a type of self-reliance that says I'm going to manage everything that I can to make sure that life goes the way I want it to. The Lord has on offer so much more for us. I'm going to trust that the Lord is going to go ahead of me. He's calling me to living a life of honesty and speaking truth and love and having my values and belief align with my behaviors and actions and attitudes. And living in that integrated way is actually healthier, more productive, more joyful, even if it's more painful. The gospel invites us into walking through the valley of the shadow of death. We want to find how we can skate around the valley of the shadow of death, which means we skate around the comfort and the presence of the Lord. We think, well, sure, it would be nice to experience God's presence and comfort, but I think I'd rather just not experience the darkness at all. It's just not realistic. We just adjust our eyes to say it's not as dark as it could be, rather than saying, what might it look like to live more fully in the light?
When people see the storm that they have to go through to get through this disclosure, we tend to think that the gospel is Christ gave us a way to hold on to him to weather life's storms, rather than the gospel is that Christ is holding on to us. And we don't have to question if God is going to be with us no matter where we wade into. And so in Christ, there's a sense of safety that comes with, I can do these hard, scary things, because at the end of the day, the most important thing has already been secured for me. That doesn't make that conflict any less real, but it does contextualize it in this broader narrative of you are headed for this glorious redemption. Therefore, it is okay to wade into those darker spaces of your life because God is already there waiting for you with the grace that you will need to get through that. David, Karen, Shari, thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And now, dear listeners, abide in him so when he appears, we may be confident and unashamed. This has been Unashamed with Executive Director Sean Maney, Clinical Director Shari Montague, Men's Director David Noble, and Spouse Care Director Karen Kallberg. Unashamed is produced by me, Jonathan Shilts. Our theme song is No Indication, used with permission by TrackTribe. Please subscribe, comment, and share to support this podcast. First Light Ministries is a nonprofit funded by the generosity of our donors. If you'd like to receive help for sexual compulsion or betrayal, visit www.firstlightstlouis.org.